On the happiest day of my only son's life, I was not allowed to appear as a proud mother in a beautiful gown, as I had always dreamed. Instead, I had to hide behind a greasy cook's uniform, my back bent, keeping my head down while my new daughter-in-law hurled insults and humiliation at me. To make it worse, she even dumped a full bowl of thick pumpkin soup over my head and sneered, telling me to stay away from her husband. I wiped the soup dripping down my face, the shame burning inside me. But I did not cry. I looked straight at her with cold, piercing eyes, silently thinking, this foolish girl doesn't realize she has just destroyed herself. If you want to know exactly what happened to me, stay with me and listen until the very end of the story. Don't forget to subscribe, like the video, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I was 61 years old when I finally understood what it meant to live with both loss and strength. My husband had passed years ago, leaving behind memories that still warmed me on quiet evenings. For decades, I had worked in finance, long hours surrounded by numbers and contracts, making careful decisions that demanded both caution and courage. That career had not only paid the bills, but also gave me the discipline to plan ahead. Now I lived from my pension and the savings I had accumulated, and it was enough to give me freedom. I owned a small house on the edge of the suburbs, nothing extravagant, but it carried the security of my own name on the deed. There were no debts waiting in the dark, no obligations tying me down, no fear that I might someday be dependent on anyone else. I kept the house neat, the garden trimmed, the porch painted every summer. The neighbors would stop by, sometimes just to chat, sometimes to ask for advice about their own financial troubles. I never claimed to have all the answers, but years of working in that world gave me clarity and confidence. They respected me, not just because I survived being a widow, but because I carried myself with dignity. I spoke carefully, thoughtfully, never rushing, and people seemed to listen. My friends often teased me that I was the very picture of an independent American woman, strong after sorrow, steady after storms. There were moments of loneliness, of course. Nights when silence filled the kitchen too completely, mornings when the bed felt too wide. Yet I had learned not to let grief define me. I filled my days with reading, volunteering at the local library, and attending gatherings with friends. Sometimes I cooked for myself as if preparing for two, a reminder that I deserved care and good meals even alone. I had become comfortable in this role, the woman who could smile after loss, who owned her home, who walked into church on Sundays with her head held high. I could see it in the way people looked at me, with a mix of admiration and perhaps curiosity about how I managed it. They did not see the tears I allowed only in the shower, or the quiet conversations I still had with my late husband's photograph. All they saw was a woman who had built a life of her own and seemed unshaken by the winds that had nearly destroyed her. In truth, I felt both proud and vulnerable. Proud because I had survived, vulnerable because I knew security could vanish in a moment. Still, at that time, I believed I had found balance. I thought the hardest battles were already behind me. My son had just crossed into his 30s, a man by age but still tender in the ways of the heart. He worked in technology, surrounded by screens and codes, yet when it came to people he carried a softness that left him unguarded. He had always been quick to believe kind words, eager to please, and searching for approval. I saw it when he was a boy, and it had not changed much with time. When he met her, everything in him seemed to light up. She was beautiful in a polished way, her smile carefully practiced, her voice smooth as honey. He spoke of her as if she were a dream made flesh. She told him stories of her background, how her father was a respected professor at a university, and her mother a dedicated physician. She painted her family as one of refinement and honor, and my son believed every word. He had always longed for a marriage that carried weight in society, something that would make him feel he belonged among the educated and admired. Her narrative touched that secret yearning like a spark finding dry wood. I tried to speak with him, gently at first. I told him that appearances could deceive, that trust must be earned over time, that he should not rush to tie his life to hers without seeing the truth beneath the charm. He listened with a polite smile, but I could see in his eyes that he did not take my words seriously. Soon my warnings became to him nothing more than the jealousy of a mother unwilling to share her son. He never said it directly, but the tone of his voice carried it. When I asked questions about her past, he would stiffen, as if defending her honor against some unjust attack. It hurt me deeply, not because he doubted me, but because I knew he was drifting into a web he could not see. I watched the way she looked at him when she thought no one was watching. There was calculation in her eyes, a hunger that had nothing to do with love. Yet he only saw the sparkle on the surface. He was enchanted, wrapped in illusions that blinded him to danger. As a mother, I felt powerless. I could not forbid him. He was no longer a child. All I could do was stand at the edge of his choices, offering my cautions, and hope that one day he would understand I spoke not from envy, but from love. Still, every time he dismissed my words, it was like a door closing between us, leaving me outside while he followed her into shadows I could not reach. It was only later, after long months of searching for truth, that I discovered how carefully the lie had been built. The respectable family she spoke of did not exist. What she presented to my son was nothing more than a stage play, crafted with precision and rehearsed down to the smallest detail. She had paid a company that specialized in false identities, a business that provided actors for those willing to spend enough cash and leave no trace behind. They supplied her with a man to play the professor father, a woman to pose as the physician mother, each instructed to follow a script as if they had lived it their whole lives. When I met them at the first dinner, I noticed how smoothly their words flowed, how one story connected neatly to the next. They spoke of the university where he taught, of the hospital where she treated patients, of conferences and medical research, of academic gatherings filled with intellectual debate. On the surface, it was flawless, the kind of polished tale designed to impress. My son looked at them with shining eyes, convinced that he had finally found a family worth admiring. He even bragged to his friends that he was about to marry the daughter of a household known for intellect and respect. But I listened differently. I watched their faces when questions strayed from the rehearsed lines. I asked about the professor's department, and he hesitated, mentioning a program that no longer existed. I asked about the physician's years of practice, and her numbers shifted from one conversation to another. Their smiles never faltered, but their knowledge did not fit the professions they claimed. It was as if they had memorized the vocabulary but never lived the work. My son brushed aside my doubts. He told me I was overthinking, that my grief for his father made me suspicious, that I should be happy he had found love. But I could not silence the alarm inside me. I saw the cracks in their performance, the places where the paint peeled to show the false wall beneath. Yet no matter how many times I tried to open his eyes, he only grew more protective of her. The more I questioned, the deeper he fell into her illusion. I carried my unease in silence then, smiling through dinners, nodding through conversations, waiting for a moment when truth might reveal itself. I felt like the lone witness in a theater where everyone else applauded the actors, while I alone knew the stage was built on lies. I knew that my instincts were not born from jealousy or fear. They were born from something sharper, the quiet alarm that rises when a story does not add up. So I made a choice that many mothers might hesitate to make. I hired a private investigator, a man licensed and seasoned in the shadows of American life, someone who specialized in unmasking fraud in both marriages and finances. He carried himself with calm authority, and when I explained my worries, he did not laugh or dismiss them. He simply nodded, as though he had heard it all before, and promised to dig until the truth surfaced. It took only a few weeks before he returned with a file so thick it made my hands tremble as I held it. Page after page painted a portrait of deceit. There were police records, prior arrests, and court documents detailing accusations of financial fraud. There were stories of money stolen, of promises made and broken, of men who had been drawn in and left in ruin. And then came the part that made my stomach twist. She had once worked the streets, selling her body under another name, long before she ever donned the costume of the educated daughter from a noble home. But it did not end there. The investigator had traced her trail of names, one after another, each discarded when it no longer served her. Social security numbers, some fabricated, some stolen, layered over her past like masks in a theater. Each mask meant to erase the last, to hide her from the reach of anyone who might uncover who she really was. The evidence was undeniable. Even I, who had suspected her all along, was shaken by the depth of the deception. I brought the file home, heavy as truth itself, and laid it before my son. I thought he would finally see, finally understand that his future was being built on lies. I spoke calmly, showing him the documents, the photos, the records. My voice was steady, but my heart pounded. He glanced through the papers, but I could see his mind had already shut the door. He pushed the folder back toward me with a look of hurt and anger. He said I was being too harsh, that I had never tried to accept her, that no woman would ever be good enough for me. His words cut deeper than he knew, not because of the insult, but because of the blindness. He chose to defend her even against the mountain of proof. In that moment, I understood that truth was not enough to break a spell. Sometimes love, or the illusion of it, is stronger than facts. I closed the folder and held my silence, but inside I knew this battle was far from over. I learned of the secret wedding the way a woman senses a storm approaching. Small hints, half-finished sentences, a sharpness in tone. The captain of the yacht called about a catering adjustment and casually mentioned a private event at sunset. My heart quickened, and I knew. If I stood by, my son would walk straight into a life built on deception, and everything he had worked for would be destroyed. That certainty gave me a resolve I had not felt in years. I called an attorney I trusted, a woman who had once helped me with estate matters. She listened carefully, her voice calm, and guided me on how to move lawfully. Gather evidence, she said. Document everything so a judge could rely on it. Request an emergency order if needed. She promised to prepare the necessary papers quickly if the moment came. Then I turned again to the investigator, the same one who had uncovered her false identities. He promised to be on standby, ready to secure any files I captured, making sure nothing would be lost. The plan began to take shape. I would not confront her directly. Instead, I would slip onto the yacht disguised as kitchen staff. I practiced the rhythm of the kitchen, learned how to move with trays and dishes, kept my head lowered, and rehearsed the look of someone invisible. I bought a plain uniform, adjusted my voice, and hid a recorder small enough to disappear behind pots and serving trays. Every detail mattered. One mistake, and the truth might slip away again. The lawyer explained state laws on recording conversations. She showed me how to preserve the evidence without breaking statutes, so prosecutors could act if needed. I made duplicate copies of the investigator's file, sealed one in an envelope, and left another with a trusted friend in case something went wrong. Each precaution was another knot in the net I was weaving. On the morning of the wedding, I stepped onto the yacht carrying a tray, my face calm though my mouth was dry. My hands followed the motions I had practiced. I noted the angles of the security cameras. I chose a place near the passage to the main deck, where the couple would appear. I busied myself with small tasks, moving quietly, my eyes sharp though my expression stayed bland. Inside, every nerve rang like a bell. Outside, I was nothing but a hired cook. I thought of my husband and his lessons in patience. I carried them with me. This was not anger that drove me, nor bitterness. It was the fierce love of a mother who knew that sometimes the only way to protect was to lay a trap. The risk was great, yet in my heart I knew it was worth everything. The plan began in the kitchen, simple in form, yet sharp in purpose. Among the many dishes being prepared for the wedding, the pumpkin soup was meant to be the highlight. I stirred the pot slowly, tasting once, then deliberately adding a pinch more salt than needed. Not enough to ruin it, but enough to draw the attention of someone eager to prove her sophistication. I knew her type, a woman who lived for the chance to flaunt knowledge, who thrived on small victories in public. To her, a soup too salty would not be an accident, but an opportunity. As the steam rose, I wiped my hands on the apron and listened to the chatter of the crew. To them, I was just another cook filling bowls, anonymous and unnoticed. But inside, my mind was sharp, my heart steady. I was setting bait, not in anger, but with the calm of a woman who had lived long enough to understand vanity. A woman like her could not resist correcting others, especially when an audience was near. I imagined the scene unfolding. Guests lifting spoons, nodding with approval, smiling at the warmth of the dish. And then she, unable to restrain herself, would raise her chin, purse her lips, and make her pronouncement. "Too salty," she would say, perhaps with a laugh meant to charm, perhaps with a sneer meant to belittle. Either way, she would expose herself. She would reveal not grace, but arrogance. This was not merely about soup. It was about drawing out her nature, stripping away the mask of sweet manners she wore for my son. For weeks she had played the part of the refined bride, delicate and flawless. Yet arrogance, once stirred, could not be contained. It would spill from her voice, her gestures, her eyes. All I needed to do was give her the stage. I kept stirring, patient, letting the flavors blend. I thought of my late husband, of how he used to remind me that small details often revealed the largest truths. Tonight, salt would be my ally. A grain too many, and her mask would begin to slip. I would watch carefully, ready to step forward, ready to see how my son looked at her when the curtain of charm finally lifted. The soup was poured into porcelain bowls, the golden color glowing under the lights. I carried a tray to the deck, head lowered, footsteps steady. No one suspected, no one knew. The trap was set, silent and waiting, and as I placed the bowls before the smiling guests, I held my breath for that inevitable moment when pride would betray her dot. She lifted the spoon with exaggerated grace, letting the golden soup drip slowly back into the bowl before finally tasting it. Then came the performance, her brows knit together in mock displeasure, followed by a sly smile that curled at the corners of her lips. Her voice carried loud enough for every guest around the table to hear. "Too much salt," she declared with a light laugh. "Whoever cooked this knows nothing about refined cuisine." The words hung in the air like a crack of thunder. Some guests shifted uncomfortably, not sure how to respond. Others, mostly her younger friends who always circled around her, broke into laughter, eager to echo her derision. Their chuckles rose together, sharp and careless. Each note meant to magnify the humiliation of the faceless cook who had prepared the dish. For a moment, the mood of the wedding feast tilted. The bride sat straighter, her eyes shining with triumph, as if she had proven her sophistication with a single bite. I watched quietly from the edge of the room, my apron in place, my hands still carrying a tray. To them, I was no one. Just an older woman hired for the evening, invisible except for the mistake she had supposedly made. Yet in my chest, calm spread like water. This was the moment I had been waiting for, the trap closing with a soft click. She had revealed herself, not as gracious or delicate, but as petty and cruel, a woman desperate to elevate herself by belittling others. The guests did not know the truth, not yet. They did not know that the soup had been seasoned by my own hand, measured not by accident but by intent. They did not know that I had counted on her vanity, her hunger to impress, her eagerness to seize any chance to play the connoisseur. Now, in her eagerness, she had taken the bait, and I stood close enough to see the gleam of pride in her eyes. I lowered the tray gently onto a side table, my heart steady, my breath even. Around me, laughter still bubbled, though some guests looked uneasy. They had come for celebration, not scorn, yet the bride's sharp voice had colored the air. No one suspected the quiet truth that was unfolding, that the cook she mocked was not a servant at all, but the mother of the groom. And as I straightened my back, preparing to step forward, I felt the weight of years fall from me. It was no longer about soup. It was about unmasking her in the presence of everyone she had tried so hard to impress. The insult lingered in the air, sharp and cutting, and I let my shoulders slump, as if the words had pierced me. Keeping my face lowered, I stepped forward from the shadows of the kitchen and approached the table with the quiet shuffle of someone used to being overlooked. My hands clasped in front of me, my apron wrinkled. I bowed slightly and spoke in a voice I had rehearsed to tremble. "Pardon me," I whispered. "Was the dish not to your liking?" Her eyes lit with satisfaction. She leaned back in her chair, relishing the attention now fully her own. Finally, a chance to perform before her guests. She tilted her chin higher, her words sharp and commanding. "A real cook should know balance," she said loudly. "A proper chef should learn the basics from the beginning. This meal is unworthy of a wedding like mine." Her voice dripped with scorn as she gestured toward the bowl, as if it were an offense rather than food. I remained in my role, lowering my head further, my silence giving her room to display herself. She was no longer the charming bride. She was a tyrant in silk, stripping away her own mask with each sentence. Some guests gasped softly, others glanced at one another with unease, but she pressed on, intoxicated by the false sense of power. Then, with a flourish meant to cement her dominance, she seized the bowl and, with a mocking smile, tipped it over. The warmth of the soup ran down my hair and face, soaking into the apron I had chosen as my disguise. Around us, murmurs spread, some shocked, some embarrassed, a few even laughing nervously. But I did not raise a hand to wipe it away. I only stood still, every second carefully measured, every gesture captured. For inside my pocket, hidden beneath the folds of cloth, the tiny recorder was at work, saving each cruel word, each humiliating act. I had not come to fight her pride with anger. I had come to let her reveal herself, to let her vanity shine so bright it burned her image into the memory of every witness. She believed she was shaming a servant. In truth, she was condemning herself before an audience that included not just the wedding guests, but, in time, the court of law. My head was bowed low, the hair I had tied back neatly now damp with soup, the apron across my chest stained with oil and broth. To anyone watching, I was nothing but another worker unlucky enough to stumble into the temper of a spoiled bride. My son moved among the guests, smiling, shaking hands, raising glasses. He did not look in my direction, did not pause to wonder why laughter and gasps rippled across the table where his bride had just made her cruel display. To him it was only a minor disturbance, perhaps a servant spilling a tray or a careless bump in the rush of service. He gave it no more thought than that. The guests, however, saw what he refused to see. They had watched the bride mock, scold, and finally pour a bowl of food over the head of the woman she believed to be beneath her. They had seen me stand still in silence, absorbing the insult with humility that was not weakness but patience. And they had seen my son, the groom, continue with his charm as though nothing had happened, blind to the humiliation playing out steps away. A few guests exchanged uneasy looks, some whispered, others frowned with quiet disgust. The sting on my skin was nothing compared to the ache in my chest. This was my only child, the boy I had raised through nights of fever and mornings of worry, the young man I had guided into adulthood with both pride and fear. And yet, here he was, so dazzled by lights and champagne, so wrapped in the glitter of appearances, that he could not recognize his own mother standing a few feet away. His indifference, though unknowing, was sharper than any insult his bride could throw. I steadied myself, refusing to let the grief show. This was the crucible I had chosen, the proof I needed not only of her cruelty, but of his blindness. The guests might not know the truth yet, but they felt the wrongness, the weight of it pressing into the celebration. In their eyes, he looked less like a groom and more like a son who had abandoned the woman who gave him life. Their silent judgment hung in the air, thick and undeniable. And in that moment, I let the pain settle deep inside me, not as defeat, but as fire. For if my own son could ignore me when I stood humiliated before his bride, then the evidence I carried had to be revealed. I could no longer protect him quietly. The stage was set, and the audience, though unaware, was already waiting. She turned from me as if I were nothing more than a rag to be tossed aside, leaning close to her circle of friends with a smirk still painted across her lips. Her voice dropped, meant to sound private, yet carried just enough for nearby ears to catch. My mother-in-law, she whispered, must be just as backward and pitiful as that old kitchen woman. The words were soft but poisoned, sharpened to wound while cloaked in a laugh. Several heads turned at once. A couple of guests froze mid-bite, their eyes darting toward her with surprise. They had already seen her humiliate someone she thought was a servant. Now they heard her cut down the very family she was joining. The insult was not only cruel but reckless, a double-edged blade. She had spat on the woman she believed to be beneath her and in the same breath revealed contempt for elders themselves. I kept my head bowed, my shoulders slumped, as if shame had silenced me. My hands twisted at the apron, my steps shuffled back toward the shadows. To the unknowing, I looked like a woman crushed, yet inside, cold satisfaction curled. Every word she thought whispered was now etched into the recorder hidden in my pocket. She had not only mocked a servant, she had dishonored her mother-in-law on the very night of her wedding, in front of witnesses too shocked to forget. I could feel the air shift, the mood around her changing. The laughter of her friends rang hollow, forced, like glass cracking under pressure. One or two of the older guests shook their heads, lips tight with disapproval. Respect for the elderly ran deep, even among those who had never met me. To scorn an old woman was one thing, but to ridicule the groom's own mother, whether she realized it or not, was beyond forgiveness. I remained silent, letting the disguise do its work, my humiliation staged, my patience sharpened like a blade. The trap was no longer just set, it had snapped shut. She had revealed her arrogance, her cruelty, and her disregard for family with her own tongue. And as I bent lower, carrying the weight of the soup-stained apron, I allowed myself a cold, hidden smile. She believed she had risen higher by stepping on me. In truth, she had just buried herself. The discovery came not in a dramatic moment, but in the quiet turning of papers late at night. I had been combing through financial records, hoping to find something that might explain the unease gnawing at me. That was when my eyes landed on a document tucked between bank statements and routine bills. It was a life insurance contract, written in neat legal terms, bearing my son's name as the insured. My heart tightened as I scanned the lines. The sole beneficiary was his fiancée. I read it twice, then a third time, unwilling to believe what the page declared. The coverage was enormous, millions of dollars promised upon his death. My hands trembled as I traced the signature. The date marked only days after he had announced his engagement. The coincidence was too precise to ignore. Love should bring gifts of joy, rings of promise, perhaps even shared savings for a new home. But this was not a gift. It was a wager, one that placed a price on my son's life. I kept reading, searching for normalcy, for some note that would ease my suspicion. Instead, the details grew darker. The entire premium had been paid in full, a lump sum delivered in cash. No checks, no traceable transfer, only bills of currency whose origin no one could question without digging deeper. Who pays millions in cash unless they wish to remain hidden? I leaned back in my chair, the file heavy in my lap. My son's signature sat on the page, naive and unquestioning, a flourish of trust given without hesitation. He must have believed it was a gesture of love, protection for the future he thought he was building. But to me, the ink looked like a chain, binding him to a danger he could not see. The room felt colder as I pieced the facts together. A sudden engagement, a woman with a past hidden behind new names, and now a life insurance policy that promised fortune at his death. My son thought he had found security, but what he had signed was a contract that could make him worth more gone than alive. I pressed the folder closed, my pulse racing. This was no longer about dignity or family honor. It was about survival. Somewhere in the shadows of her plans, my son had become a means to an end, a ticket to wealth she could never earn honestly. And I, his mother, was the only one who saw it. The truth began to sharpen into something darker when I asked the investigator to dig deeper, this time into her financial and credit history. He worked within the law, drawing from commercial databases that licensed detectives in America are permitted to use. After several days, he called me with a voice steady but edged with unease. He had found a transaction that could not be ignored. Just weeks before the wedding, she had purchased a premium life insurance policy in my son's name. The documents were precise. The policy was worth millions, and she was listed as the sole beneficiary. But one line stopped the investigator cold. The electronic file contained no valid signature from my son. The space reserved for confirmation was blank, a detail that suggested forgery. In the world of insurance, signatures are sacred, the proof that the insured has given consent. Without his mark, the contract was not just suspicious, it was fraudulent. Then came the recording. By law, American insurance companies must keep tapes of consultations, and the detective had obtained a copy. I sat with the headphones pressed to my ears as her voice filled the room. She was calm, almost casual, yet the words slid like ice. If something were to happen on a yacht, she asked, would the payout still apply? The agent on the line answered mechanically, yes, accidents were covered. Her little laugh followed, soft but chilling, the kind of sound that told me she already pictured the outcome. I removed the headphones slowly, my breath shallow. It was one thing to suspect her greed. It was another to hear her plan death with her own lips. The pieces fell into place. The sudden engagement, the hidden past, the life insurance money that would make her rich if tragedy struck. My son was not just at risk of heartbreak. He was in danger of being murdered. The detective's final report drove the fear deeper. He had traced a reservation under her name, not for the yacht of the ceremony, but for a smaller boat scheduled for the day after the wedding. The purpose was vague, the details incomplete, but the timing spoke volumes. A private vessel, a bride newly enriched by a policy worth millions, and a husband who might conveniently vanish into the sea. It was a script too neat to be coincidence. I pressed the file against my chest, the weight unbearable. She had planned not only to bind my son in marriage, but to end his life in water dark and deep. What she saw as a simple accident, I saw as calculated murder disguised by waves. The law might call it insurance fraud, attempted homicide, premeditation. To me it was simpler still. It was a mother's nightmare, staring at the proof that her child had become prey. I carried the thick folder into the law office with hands that felt heavy, not from age but from the weight of what it contained. The attorney I had chosen was a woman seasoned in financial crimes and insurance fraud, her shelves lined with books of case law, and her desk stacked with files of battles fought in court. I laid the documents before her, insurance contracts, recordings, receipts, every page gathered with precision. She read quickly but thoroughly, her eyes narrowing, her pen tapping once against the desk. When she finally looked up, her voice was firm. This was more than suspicion, it was conspiracy. She wasted no time. Within hours, she filed an emergency petition with the court. The request was twofold. First, to seal the questionable insurance records so they could not be altered or erased. Second, to authorize close monitoring of the wedding scheduled on the yacht. A judge, recognizing the risk, signed the order. The law had shifted to stand at my side. The next call was to the police. With the court's backing, they could act not as observers, but as guardians. They prepared a discreet presence, plainclothes officers among the staff, patrol boats ready near the harbor. Their mission was clear: to protect my son's life, and to move in the moment danger revealed itself. As I listened to the plan, a deep calm settled over me. For weeks I had carried this burden alone, afraid my fears would be dismissed as paranoia. Now, with the seal of the court and the strength of the law, my steps were no longer hesitant. Every move I made would be anchored in legality, beyond reproach, immune to counterattack. If she or her allies tried to twist the story, they would find themselves cornered by statutes and evidence stronger than their lies. I left the office with a copy of the court order folded in my purse, the paper smooth but powerful. Outside, the city moved as if nothing had changed, traffic flowing, people rushing to lunch, but to me, the air felt lighter. I was no longer fighting in the shadows. I was armed with the law itself. That night, as I placed the documents in a locked drawer, I whispered a quiet promise to my son, though he could not hear. "You are safe now," I said. "They cannot touch you. The trap they set has become their cage, and when the time comes, the law will speak louder than any mother's cry." I decided to keep everything secret and let her believe her plan was foolproof. Secrecy felt like armor, and also like a blade, sharp and necessary. I moved through the kitchen with the same slow, practiced steps I had rehearsed, pretending to be nothing more than a temporary cook, while beneath the apron I secured a small recorder and a tiny camera sewn into the lining of my uniform. Every device I placed had been tested for angle and clarity, and each memory card was duplicated and locked away with the investigator. I thought of all the nights I had spent alone adding up bills and receipts, and suddenly those hours of quiet vigilance felt like preparation for this single night. The lawyer had been precise in her warnings and clear in her orders. "Keep the evidence clean," she had said, "and the court will listen, but do not alert anyone who might slip away." The police would wait on the water line and plainclothes officers would be blended with the crew. They would not interfere unless I gave the signal, and that signal I promised myself would come only when the truth was undeniable. I rehearsed the moment in my head as I worked. I pictured her voice turning sharp. I pictured my son looking confused, and I pictured the cameras catching every expression like witnesses with no mercy. My heart thudded against my ribs sometimes, quick and raw, but my hands were steady. Years of managing accounts had taught me how to steady the numbers and steady a hand. I placed a second device inside a folded napkin in the galley drawer and another inside my shoe, a ridiculous comfort that made me smile briefly at myself. If something happened to block a line of sight, the audio would still tell the story. The staff thought I was a quiet woman who preferred to work without fuss, and they asked no questions. That anonymity was my ally. On the phone with the investigator earlier, I had heard his short confirmation that he had the backups and that the secure server was ready. That small certainty calmed the stricter parts of me. My lawyer had faxed the court order to seal the insurance file and to authorize surveillance. She had also explained how to preserve chain of custody for recordings so no clever defense could claim tampering. I folded my apron over my arm and felt the fabric like a flag of purpose. The plan was not vengeance, it was prevention, and I repeated that line to myself until it felt true. I would let her reveal herself with her own words and gestures, and when the evidence was complete, the law would do the rest. As guests began to arrive, I smoothed my uniform and kept my head low. At moments, I found my voice practicing a polite question I would ask later, a question that would not sound like accusation, but would open the door to explanation. All the while I listened, because listening was the work that mattered. Every whisper, every careless joke, every small slip would be a key. I had woven a careful net of law and technology and quiet patience, and now I waited for the moment when the net would draw tight and truth would no longer be a secret dot. At first, my suspicion had been simple, almost ordinary in the ugly world of human weakness. I thought she was a gold digger, a woman who saw my son's home, his savings, his steady job in technology, and decided to marry not the man, but the wealth he carried. It was shameful, yes, but survivable. Men recover from heartbreak, I told myself. A greedy bride could be exposed, and life would move on. But the deeper the investigator dug, the more I studied the documents, the clearer it became that greed was only the surface. Beneath it lay something far darker. The insurance policies with missing signatures, the lump sums of cash, the secret yacht reservation, the recording of her voice asking if accidents at sea would still be covered. Each piece fit together like a puzzle that painted not a careless opportunist, but a killer in disguise. She had not come only to take. She had come to destroy. The realization struck me like a blow. This was not about jewels or property, not about access to a bank account or a last name. It was about life itself. My son's life, the boy I had held through sickness and triumph, the man I had prayed for every night. She had wrapped him in promises, but behind those vows was a timetable for murder. The wedding was not her victory, it was her deadline. I sat alone with the file spread before me, my hands pressed against the paper as though to keep it from flying away. My heart thudded heavily in my chest, each beat louder than the last. The story had twisted beyond my imagination. What began as a shallow tale of a fortune hunter had turned into a crime of cold calculation, chilling in its precision. For a moment I closed my eyes and pictured the scene as she must have seen it: the yacht gliding across the water, the champagne flowing, and then a sudden scream, a splash, confusion, and tears. An accident, the guests would whisper, a tragedy, and somewhere in the paperwork millions of dollars would shift quietly into her hands. The thought made my breath falter. The danger was not distant or vague. It was scheduled, prepared, imminent. If I did nothing, if I let the wedding play out as she intended, I could lose my only child before the night was through. That certainty cut deeper than any grief I had ever known. I opened my eyes with a steadiness I had not felt in years. There was no longer room for hesitation or denial. This was no longer about protecting property or saving pride. It was about life and death. And I knew then, with every fiber of my being, that if I did not act, my son would not survive his own wedding day. I knew that if the truth were to stand in court, it needed to be seen as well as heard. So I called on an old acquaintance, a technician who had worked with security systems for years. Together, in the quiet hours before the wedding, we boarded the yacht under the pretense of routine preparations. He carried a small toolkit, nothing flashy, and within it the eyes and ears that would guard my son. The cameras were disguised cleverly, built into the corners of the galley and the trim of the main dining room. No guest would ever notice them, but their lenses would capture every sneer, every gesture, every cruel act. Each device streamed live to a secure channel, its feed routed directly to the computer in my lawyer's office on shore. From there, she and her team could watch in real time, recording and archiving every second. It meant that even if something happened to me, the truth would already be stored safely beyond the reach of tampering. I felt a measure of relief, knowing that justice would not rely on memory alone, but on proof that no one could deny. Still, I added one more layer of certainty. In the pocket of my cook's uniform, I placed a miniature recorder, small enough to go unnoticed but strong enough to capture every word. I wanted the insults, the orders, the tone of contempt that revealed her nature. To belittle an elder, to humiliate and mock, might seem trivial to some. But under the law, it was abuse, emotional violence that could be proven in court. I would endure it, not as a victim, but as a witness. The technician worked quickly, his movements quiet and precise. Within an hour, the system was in place. Tiny lights blinked once, then disappeared into silence, their signals invisible but steady. He tested each feed, showing me a screen filled with crisp images of the kitchen and the glittering hall where the guests would gather. Everything worked. Everything was legal, authorized under the court order we had obtained. No trickery, no loophole, only the clean strength of evidence gathered within the law. When he left, carrying only his tools, I stood alone in the kitchen and breathed deeply. Around me, the yacht was just a place of celebration, but hidden in its walls was a network of truth, a net woven by technology and law. I touched the pocket where the recorder rested and felt strangely calm. The stage was set, not just for a wedding, but for the unmasking of a predator. And this time, I would not be alone. The law itself was watching with me. The captain was a man of discipline, his voice steady as the tide, his uniform pressed to the last button. When the court order reached him, stamped and signed with legal authority, he did not hesitate. He understood his duty, not only as the master of the vessel, but as a citizen bound by law. Quietly, he assured me that he would cooperate fully. The yacht, he said, would sail as scheduled, but its course and crew would serve the law before any guest. He kept my secret as carefully as a locked chart. To the sailors and servers, I was nothing more than a cook hired for the night, an older woman with tired eyes and hands practiced in stirring pots. He introduced me that way without a flicker of doubt, and the crew nodded, uninterested in the details. My disguise was complete. Within their eyes, I was invisible, which was exactly what I needed. In his logbook, the captain prepared entries that no guest would ever read. There, between notes of weather and tide, he wrote the contingency plan. Should evidence of crime arise, the yacht would break course and head for the nearest port, reporting to the authorities waiting on shore. It was all written in the calm hand of a man who had guided ships through storms, a man who knew how to keep order even when chaos lurked below deck. The arrangement gave me strength. The yacht was no longer just a stage for celebration, nor a trap for my son. It had become something else, a courtroom adrift on open water, where the law observed silently, waiting for truth to reveal itself. Every laugh, every toast, every cruel word spoken would carry weight, not only in the moment but in the records already secured by the court. As I stood near the galley, watching the captain move across the deck with quiet authority, I felt a rare comfort. He was not just steering the vessel, he was guarding justice. The guests believed they were aboard a floating palace of love and wealth, but beneath the music and champagne lay a hidden tribunal. And when the time came, when her mask slipped and her words condemned her, this ship would not carry her toward triumph. It would carry her toward judgment. I sat across from her, watching each motion like a rehearsal for a trial. She moved with the authority of someone who had spent her life fighting paper wars, and I felt small and safe at the same time. She printed everything I had brought, not a scrap left to chance: the false insurance contract with my son listed as insured, and the beneficiary line bearing the fiancé alone, the call recording from the insurer in which the bride had asked whether an accident on a yacht would still trigger payout, the bank records showing sudden cash payments, the investigator notes tracing alias after alias, and the actors hired to play a respectable family. My lawyer arranged the pages into neat stacks, stamped copies, and signed each certification with a steady hand. She explained the chain of custody she would establish so no one could contest authenticity. I listened while she said that every document would be notarized and sealed, that each recording would be logged with timestamps and stored on a secure server, and that duplicates would be handed to the investigator and to a court registrar. She recommended the exact wording to submit for a supplemental warrant, the legal phrasing that would require the insurer to freeze the policy and bar any disbursement, and she drafted the motion to allow law enforcement to intervene immediately the evidence appeared. I watched her prepare the arrest provision, the part of the petition that would let officers step in and place the bride into custody if her own words and deeds revealed the crime. The feeling of that plan being put into motion was both terrifying and a balm. Terror because the stakes were life and death, balm because the law was no longer only a hope but a tool at my disposal. She certified the copies and placed them in tamper-proof envelopes, then sealed them with the court order already attached. She said that she would file the motion first thing in the morning, that she would call the judge on duty and ask for a rapid ruling, and that police would be notified to stand by. I asked if this would expose me, risk scaring them away, and she answered that the careful sealing and the procedural chain would protect me and preserve the admissibility of evidence. She also prepared contingency language to prevent any countersuits for defamation or false accusation, so every step I took would be shielded by the rule of law and not seen as a reckless personal vendetta. The file she handed me contained signed affidavits from the investigator, copies of the recordings certified by a forensic analyst, and a copy of the draft warrant with the judge-clerk's stamp line already reserved. He would wait on shore with officers in plain clothes. She would wait for my signal. I would give it only when the deception was undeniable. I left her office with the envelopes heavy in my bag and a strange steadiness in my chest. For the first time since suspicion became certainty, the path ahead was legal, precise, and ready to protect my son. I knew from the beginning that strength would not unmask her. If I confronted her with anger, she would only twist it, crying victim while my son stood between us. No, the way to reveal her was to let her believe she was untouchable. That was why I chose the role of cook, the lowest place in the hierarchy of a celebration like this. In that apron, with my hair pulled back and my face lowered, I was invisible, and invisibility was the perfect bait. Before the yacht filled with guests, I gathered the servers in the galley and spoke quietly. If she raises her voice, I told them, if she mocks me or treats me with disdain, do not step in. Let it pass. They looked uncertain at first, but I assured them this was part of the arrangement, sanctioned by the captain and protected by the law. Their job was to serve, not to shield me. I wanted her to think she could do anything, that no one would stop her. It was a dangerous game, but a necessary one. I understood her type. She thrived on superiority, on the belief that she was smarter, prettier, richer than everyone around her. She needed an audience to confirm her power, and she needed someone weaker to crush in order to shine. By making myself the target, I gave her the stage she craved. She would not resist the temptation to humiliate me, and in doing so, she would reveal more than she intended. Every word, every insult, every gesture would not fade into air but be preserved in the silent memory of machines. The recorder in my pocket would capture the sharp edge of her tone, the sneer curling in her voice. The hidden cameras would show her eyes glittering with pride as she ridiculed an older woman. And when all the fragments were pieced together, the image would be undeniable. Cruelty, arrogance, abuse. Not hearsay, not suspicion, but proof. As I stood among the clatter of dishes and the hum of preparations, I felt both fear and purpose. Fear, because I knew the sting of words and the weight of public shame. Purpose, because I knew that every humiliation she delivered would only tighten the trap. My silence was not weakness, it was strategy. And the more she believed I was powerless, the more powerful the evidence would become. The plan in my mind was as sharp as a blade, each step rehearsed until it no longer felt like imagination but certainty. I would endure long enough to let her tongue betray her, to let her arrogance spill unchecked before the hidden cameras and recorders. Once the insults had piled into a mountain no one could deny, once her cruelty had shown itself plainly, I would give the signal. It would be small, a gesture agreed upon with the captain, and with that motion the yacht would no longer sail forward into celebration. It would turn, steady and deliberate, back toward shore. On land, the stage was already prepared. Police officers stood ready at the dock, plainclothes among the crowd, uniformed men waiting nearby. My lawyer had arranged it so that the moment the boat touched land, the law would rise to its full height. The warrant was signed, the affidavit sealed, the evidence logged and ready to be delivered. What she thought was her triumphal procession would become the march to her undoing. But before the final step, I would shed the disguise she had mocked. I pictured the moment in my heart as if it had already happened. I would remove the stained apron, the symbol of invisibility, and stand tall in the dress hidden beneath, shoulders squared, chin lifted. No longer a cook to be humiliated, I would reveal myself as the mother she had despised, and more than that, as the keeper of truth. I would not shout, I would not rage, I would speak with the weight of evidence behind me, my voice steady as I announced that every word, every gesture, every drop of cruelty had been recorded. I would lay out the false insurance, the fraudulent names, the hired actors, the voice recording of her plotting accidents at sea. The guests, her audience, would become my jury. It was not only a counterattack. It was a tribunal afloat, a court on water. Justice would not wait for a courtroom with four walls. It would rise here, under the open sky, before witnesses who had toasted love and now would watch betrayal laid bare. She would see in that moment that her stage had never been hers. It had been mine all along. The ceremony had reached its peak. The guests hushed as the master of ceremonies lifted his voice, ready to pronounce the union. Music swelled softly, glasses sparkled under chandeliers, and all eyes were fixed on the couple. In that instant, I felt the weight of my disguise pressing against my skin, the apron heavy with grease stains, the cook's cap damp against my hair. My heart beat steady, not wild, as I stepped forward from the edge of the room. The clatter of my shoes against the polished floor cut through the silence. Heads turned. Some frowned, puzzled by the sight of an older servant intruding on the sacred moment. But I kept walking, each step measured, each breath deliberate. I reached the center of the aisle, and there, with all the poise I had stored for this hour, I unclasped the apron. The fabric fell in a tired heap at my feet. My hands rose to the cap, tugged it free, and for the first time that night, my face was uncovered in the light. Gasps spread like a ripple across the crowd. Beneath the uniform, I wore the dress I had chosen carefully. A dress of quiet elegance, its lines simple yet strong, a garment that spoke of dignity rather than ostentation. I stood tall, my spine unbent, my chin lifted. The servant had vanished. In her place was a mother, a woman of years and wisdom, a figure who commanded attention without raising her voice. My eyes met the bride's, and I watched the confidence drain from hers. The smirk that had adorned her lips earlier faltered, replaced by a flash of panic. She blinked once, twice, as though trying to clear her vision. To her, I was supposed to be invisible, a cook too low to matter. Yet here I was, revealed in front of her guests, not only visible but formidable. The guests sat frozen, their whispers building into a murmur. Some recognized me instantly, the mother of the groom, a widow known for her composure and independence. Others simply stared, captivated by the transformation. The air itself seemed to tighten, the illusion snapping in two. I did not speak yet. Words would come soon, but silence in that moment carried more power than 1,000 speeches. I let them see me, all of me, the steadiness in my gaze, the calm in my stance, the quiet authority that no humiliation could erase. The apron lay discarded, the mask destroyed. And for the first time since this charade began, it was she, not I, who stood uncertain and exposed. From the folds of my pocket, I drew out the document that had been pressed close to my heart since the day the judge signed it. The paper was crisp, its seal heavy with the authority of law. I raised it high so all could see, and my voice carried across the hall, strong and unwavering. Captain, by order of the federal court, I command you to turn this vessel back to shore at once. For a heartbeat, silence clung to the air. Then the captain, a man of duty whose word carried weight on the sea, stepped forward. He met my gaze, gave a firm nod, and without hesitation lifted his radio. His voice was clipped, precise, the tone of command. Within seconds the engines shifted, the deck beneath our feet gave the faintest tremor, and the yacht began to change its course. Guests stirred in confusion, whispers spreading like fire across dry grass. Why had the ceremony stopped? What law could halt a wedding mid-vow? Faces turned to one another, searching for answers that would not come. The glittering air of celebration dimmed into unease, the laughter replaced by murmurs that grew sharper with each passing second. The bride reacted first, her shock breaking into panic. She stepped forward, her voice shrill with fury. "Stop!" she shouted. "You cannot do this! Keep sailing!" But her commands carried no weight here. The captain's eyes were cold, his hand steady on the radio. At his side stood two men the guests had not noticed before, plainclothes officers who revealed their badges with quiet authority. Their presence silenced her protests as effectively as iron chains. Her defiance faltered under their gaze. She tried again, weaker now, insisting it was a mistake, that no one had the right to interrupt her wedding. But the court's seal gleamed in my hand, and the law had spoken louder than any denial. The crew obeyed their captain, the officers stood firm, and she, for the first time, found herself powerless. I stood tall in the center of it all, my dress free of the apron that once hid me, my voice echoing still in the silence that followed. The yacht was no longer her stage, it was a courtroom at sea, and the verdict had already begun. From the far end of the room, another figure stepped forward, the lawyer I had trusted with every secret. He moved with deliberate calm, a leather case in his hand. Without ceremony, he reached the nearest table and spread its contents wide. Stacks of paper, thick and damning, slid across the polished wood. The guests leaned closer, curiosity flickering into dread as they caught glimpses of what lay there. The first document was the life insurance policy, pages marked with dates and signatures, or rather, the absence of them. The name of my son stood printed, yet the space for his consent was blank. My lawyer placed his hand on the page and raised his voice so that every person could hear. This contract, he declared, was fraudulent. It was designed to profit not from a marriage, but from a death. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Wine glasses paused midway to lips, eyes widened in disbelief. Next came the recording. A small device played the clipped tones of the bride's voice. If something were to happen on a yacht, she asked, would the payout still apply? Her words rang across the hall, thin and sharp, echoing against the silence that followed. The guests exchanged horrified looks. Some shook their heads. Others pressed their hands to their mouths as though to stop a cry. Then the emails were revealed. Strings of correspondence between her and a service that specialized in false identities. Scripts exchanged, payments arranged in cash, instructions for the actors who had posed as her parents and kin. One by one, their lies fell apart beneath the weight of official seals and notarized stamps. Finally, my lawyer lifted the financial records. Sudden deposits, unexplained transfers, the trail of deceit as clear as ink on the page. His voice was steady, almost judicial, as he read each line aloud. The room itself seemed to shrink, the chandeliers casting harder shadows, the festive air replaced by the heavy silence of judgment. I stood beside him, saying nothing. My eyes scanned the crowd, watching recognition and shock dawn on their faces. I did not need to shout, nor did I need to accuse. The truth was laid bare, and it spoke more loudly than I ever could. The bride stood rigid, her color draining, her mouth opening only to close again. For the first time, she was the one rendered speechless. In that moment, the yacht was no longer a place of vows and celebration. It had become a courtroom adrift at sea, where the evidence spoke louder than champagne toasts, and the verdict was already written in the silence of the guests. The bride's face drained of color. The confidence that had once draped her like silk now ripped away in an instant. Her hands trembled at her sides, her lips parted, but no words came at first. Then, with a stammering breath, she tried to deny what was laid before her. "It is not true," she whispered, then louder, her voice cracking. "This is a mistake, a setup." Yet each time her words faltered against the weight of the evidence, the room answered not with sympathy, but with silence. Her so-called parents, seated proudly only moments before, shifted uneasily in their chairs. Their eyes darted toward the exit, their composure unraveling. One stood, then the other, and without a word they slipped away from the table. Their sudden flight was louder than any confession. Guests turned to watch them vanish through the door, murmurs rising like a tide. The truth no longer needed explanation. The charade was collapsing under its own weight. Phones began to rise from pockets and purses. Screens glowed in the dim light as guests recorded what they knew would be talked about for years. The bride's humiliation was no longer private. It was captured, preserved, and shared. Each angle showed her trembling hands, her darting eyes, the chaos that no veil or smile could disguise. She spun toward the crowd, desperation blazing in her eyes. "No!" she screamed, her voice sharp and wild. "This is a conspiracy, a plot to ruin me." Her cry cut through the air, but it rang hollow. No one believed her anymore. Not after the papers stamped with court seals. Not after the recording of her own voice. Not after the actors who had played her family abandoned her so completely. The silence that followed was heavier than her protest. Some guests shook their heads, others whispered to one another, their eyes hard with disapproval. A few raised their phones higher, ensuring every second was captured. The woman who had sought admiration now stood exposed, her image torn apart before the very audience she had tried so hard to impress. And I, standing at the center, did not need to speak. The truth had spoken already, and her downfall echoed louder than any words I could have delivered. My son stood as if carved from stone, his body rigid, his face drained of all color. His eyes glistened, rimmed red, yet he could not bring himself to meet mine. Shame held him captive. The shame of every word he had once thrown at me, the disbelief, the wounded pride that had blinded him. Around him, the voices of the crowd swirled like distant wind, but he seemed deaf to all of it. When the lawyer laid down the final sheet, the insurance contract, stamped and sealed, proof beyond denial that his bride-to-be had plotted not for love but for his death, he staggered back. His knees bent as if the weight of the paper alone could crush him. A hand shot out to grip the back of a chair, his breath ragged, his chest heaving with the raw ache of betrayal. The world he thought he knew had collapsed in a single moment, and there was no place left to hide from it. At last, his eyes lifted, trembling toward me. What he found was not judgment in my gaze, but something deeper, sharper, the fierce ache of a mother who had fought in silence, who had risked everything to save him. I had carried the truth like a burden across fire, and now he saw it clearly. He saw that it was I, not she, who had stood between him and the grave. His lips parted, but no sound came. All he could do was look, wide-eyed, at the woman he had doubted, the woman who had just saved his life. The bride's cries still echoed, shrill and desperate, but he no longer heard her. His heart had split open, and all illusions had drained away. The vows he had dreamed of, the life he thought awaited him, all shattered into shards at his feet. There was no love left, no trust, only the chilling knowledge that he had been moments from becoming a casualty in a performance staged with cruel precision. The guests, silent and pale, watched not only the downfall of the bride, but the awakening of the groom. His world, once dressed in illusion, now stood naked and harsh. And as he bent his head, tears trembling on his lashes, everyone could see that this was not just the ruin of a wedding, but the breaking of a heart that had trusted too easily. The moment the yacht touched the dock, the festive air collapsed into the heavy silence of authority. Waiting there were officers in uniform and plainclothes, their presence steady and unyielding. As the gangplank lowered, they stepped aboard with purpose. In the center of the commotion, the bride froze, her defiance drained into a pale mask of fear. One officer unfolded a paper, his voice firm and clear, echoing across the stunned crowd. By order of the federal court, you are under arrest for suspected insurance fraud and conspiracy to commit homicide. Gasps rose among the guests, but the officers wasted no time. They guided her firmly to one side, their movements efficient, their tone professional. Her protests, sharp and frantic, fell flat against the gravity of the law. Hands trembling, she clutched at her dress, but they were already cataloging her belongings. Her phone, her laptop, every document she carried, all were placed into sealed evidence bags. Even the papers she had tried to keep hidden in her purse were laid bare, tagged, and logged. The scene was no longer a wedding. It was an active crime investigation. She was escorted down the plank toward a waiting vehicle, cameras from guests following her every step. At the station, the process unfolded with clinical precision. Fingerprints, photographs, the paperwork of custody, all completed while she sat stiff and pale, eyes darting to the lawyer who rushed in at her side. He spoke quickly, promising defense, but the stack of evidence waiting on the desk was already too high. The audio recordings, the forged insurance contracts, the suspicious cash transfers, they formed a mountain too steep to climb. Because the case reached beyond state lines, touching federal insurance systems and carrying the shadow of attempted murder, it moved swiftly into the hands of a federal prosecutor. The file was heavy, stamped with urgency. The prosecutor accepted it with the seriousness of someone who understood that this was not just fraud, but a crime that nearly cost a man his life. For the guests, the image of her being led away would remain etched in memory. For me, standing at the edge of the dock, it was not triumph, but grim necessity. Justice had begun its course, and though the road ahead would be long, the first step had been taken. The mask was gone. The law was now in motion. When the case file reached the prosecutor's desk, it was no longer the story of a failed wedding, but a criminal matter of the highest gravity. The list of possible charges stretched long, each one heavy on its own, but together forming a chain strong enough to bind her future. The most immediate was insurance fraud. She had tried to profit from a policy written on another person's life under false pretenses. Alongside it came forgery, the falsification of my son's signature, the deliberate act of pretending his consent to a contract that would have turned his death into her payday. Then came the darkest charge, conspiracy to commit murder. The evidence suggested that the wedding was never about love, but about creating the perfect stage for an accident at sea. The recording of her own voice, asking whether a yacht tragedy would still trigger payment, stood as a chilling confirmation of intent. Layered with financial records of sudden cash transactions, the picture of premeditation grew clear. If investigators found further proof of concealed transfers, she could also face charges of financial fraud or even money laundering for moving funds to hide their origin. Technology left its own fingerprints. Should experts confirm that electronic systems were used to forge my son's digital approval, she could face yet another charge: identity theft. To impersonate someone in order to bind them to a deadly contract was not only deceit, but a crime that struck at the very core of personal security. The prosecutor weighed these charges carefully, knowing each carried different sentencing guidelines. Depending on the strength of the evidence and the involvement of any accomplices, such as the actors hired to play her family, the court might deny bail entirely or set a conditional release, seizing her assets in the meantime. Her phones, her bank accounts, her luxury purchases could all be frozen to ensure no profit was left from her schemes. The road ahead was mapped by criminal procedure: further investigation, the formal indictment, the arraignment before a judge. There would be the possibility of a plea bargain if she admitted guilt, or a full trial if she refused. But if the charge of attempted murder held, the sentence could stretch not in months or years, but in decades. The thought was sobering even to the prosecutors. This was not a petty fraud, but a cold plan that had nearly taken a life. What had begun as a day of vows was now the opening of a long legal battle. The law would strip away illusions just as surely as the apron I had cast aside. And the punishment, if justice was served, would be as harsh as the crime itself. In the prosecutor's office, the file grew heavier with every page added. Each document, each recording, each transaction whispered the shape of crimes too grave to ignore. The preliminary review outlined the charges that might soon be read aloud in a courtroom. Insurance fraud stood at the top, the most obvious, with a forged policy designed to profit from the sudden death of her fiancé. Alongside it came forgery, the falsification of signatures, both on paper and in digital records. More chilling still was conspiracy to commit murder, a charge that carried the weight of intent, showing that she had not only plotted to deceive, but also to kill. Financial investigators dug deeper, following the trail of cash deposits and suspicious transfers. If the money had been layered and disguised to conceal its origin, another charge would appear: financial fraud or money laundering. The pattern of payments to hired actors, the shell accounts used to move funds, all became threads woven into the larger web of deceit. There was also the question of technology. If experts could prove she had used software or stolen credentials to falsify electronic signatures, the case could expand further into identity theft, a federal offense carrying years of prison time. Each layer added more weight to the file, turning it from scandal into a mountain of criminal liability. The prosecutor considered the severity. Depending on the strength of evidence and the role of accomplices, he could petition for pretrial detention, arguing that she was a flight risk, or else impose conditional bail with strict monitoring. Regardless, her assets, from bank accounts to property, would likely be frozen, ensuring that none of the fraudulent gains could be hidden or spent. The criminal process was already set in motion. Investigators would continue gathering records, depositions, and forensic analysis. Once the indictment was filed, a preliminary hearing would follow, where the charges would be formally read. She could choose to plead guilty in hopes of reducing her sentence, or she could stand trial, where every piece of evidence would be laid bare before a jury. If conspiracy to commit murder was proven beyond reasonable doubt, the sentence could be life-altering, decades behind bars, perhaps even life imprisonment. For the woman who had once stood in white lace before a crowd, dreaming of applause, the path ahead now held only steel bars, courtrooms, and the crushing weight of justice. While the criminal case moved forward, the civil and financial consequences began to unfold in parallel, each step tightening the net around her. The insurance company, faced with a policy riddled with fraud, launched an immediate internal investigation. Their first action was swift and decisive: suspend all payments, freeze the account tied to the policy, and initiate proceedings to void the contract. With evidence of forgery and deception, there would be no payout, not a cent to the named beneficiary. What was once plotted as a path to wealth had dissolved into a trail of legal ruin. For my son and me, the civil route opened as another avenue of justice. With the guidance of our lawyer, we could file a civil suit demanding damages for defamation, emotional distress, and the mounting legal expenses forced upon us. Each sleepless night, each moment of humiliation in front of friends and neighbors, each dollar spent to unmask the conspiracy, these could be translated into claims for compensation. The court could also order restitution of any funds wrongfully transferred or used to set the stage for fraud. Attention turned to the actors who had played her family. If they had knowingly taken part in the deception, understanding its purpose and accepting money for their roles, they too could face civil liability. Aiding and abetting in fraud, even without wielding the pen or signing the false contract, carried weight under the law. And if their contracts revealed clauses designed to hide the true purpose of their employment, those documents would become damning proof against them, binding them to the conspiracy they thought was hidden in shadows. The system was thorough. If any assets had been distributed prematurely, such as advances tied to the policy or funds siphoned through shell accounts, the civil courts and the Asset Recovery Division would step in. Their task was to claw back every dollar, to reverse every improper payment. The responsibility for these costs would not fall on the victims, but on the perpetrator and her accomplices. In practical terms, it meant years of financial collapse for her. Bank accounts frozen, property seized, credit ruined, debts piling from judgments. Where she once dreamed of stepping into a life of luxury, she now faced a lifetime of repayments, restitution orders, and the stigma of fraud branded into every financial record she left behind. For me, it was not greed or vengeance that mattered. It was principle. Justice had to be whole, not only in the prison sentence she might face, but also in the restoration of what had been lost: our dignity, our security, and the truth that money obtained through deceit would never be hers to keep. The news spread faster than the tide. By the time the police car carried her away, half the guests had already uploaded their recordings. Videos of her protests, her trembling denials, and the officers reading the charges flooded social media within hours. Local reporters picked up the story, their headlines sharp and merciless: "Bride arrested at yacht wedding and insurance fraud plot." From there it spread to larger outlets, and soon her name was no longer whispered at private parties, but plastered across news tickers and trending feeds. The reaction was swift and unforgiving. The so-called parents who had played their roles slipped into hiding, but it was too late. Their faces appeared in the videos, their identities unearthed within days. What had once seemed like a respectable family collapsed into disgrace. Employers severed ties, acquaintances vanished, and online forums dissected every fragment of their deception. Invitations, memberships, partnerships, all evaporated under the heat of public outrage. For the bride, the fall was absolute. Those who once admired her charm now shunned her name. Friends withdrew, social clubs revoked her presence, and the professional contacts she flaunted disappeared one by one. Her carefully curated image of sophistication turned to ash. Instead of admiration, her life became a case study in betrayal and greed, replayed again and again by strangers' fingers on glowing screens. My son did not escape untouched. His shame was laid bare along with hers. People whispered about how easily he had been deceived, how blind love had carried him into danger. But with the shame came an unexpected grace. Voices rose to defend him, to acknowledge the cruelty he had endured. Many praised the fact that, at the brink of disaster, it was his mother who had acted with strength and clarity. The story, retold again and again, became not only about a woman's treachery, but also about a mother's resolve. This was karma made visible. Not in shadows, not whispered behind doors, but played out in full view of the public. She lost her face, her money, her future, all at once. And while the courts would decide her sentence, society had already delivered its own dot. In the days that followed, my son began to awaken from the fog he had lived in. His first words to me were halting, heavy with guilt. Apologies for doubting me, for siding with a woman who had nearly led him to his death. I listened, my heart torn between pain and relief. He offered his testimony to the investigators, his voice trembling as he confirmed what the evidence already showed. It was the first step on a long road of redemption, a path that would require time, patience, and perhaps the guidance of counselors to rebuild what had been broken between us. Trust once shattered is not easily restored, but at least the first bricks were being laid. For myself, I emerged with what mattered most: my dignity intact, my home and savings safe, my independence unbroken. The law had shielded what was mine, and I was grateful for the foresight that had kept everything in my name. Yet I did not see this ordeal as mine alone. I began to imagine how my story could serve others, how my voice might carry to those who had been silenced. Perhaps I could join an association for elder protection. Perhaps I could give donations or counsel those who feared they too might fall prey to greed, disguised as love. My scars, though invisible, could be repurposed into shields for someone else. The case, of course, would not end quickly. The criminal charges against her would wind their way through courtrooms, hearings, and headlines. Civil suits would drag behind, demanding restitution and the return of every ill-gotten dollar. The actors who had played their roles might also face judgment, the law reaching further than they ever expected. For me, though, the courtroom no longer defined my days. A new chapter had begun, quieter, steadier, where peace was no longer fragile but chosen. I walked again in my garden, watered the roses, sat in the small chair where the sun touched my shoulders. Life felt ordinary, and yet within that ordinariness was strength. I had faced betrayal, violence, and humiliation, and I had not only survived, but spoken. People often say that old age is weakness, but to me it is the time when wisdom becomes a weapon. And those who are greedy, those who are cruel, will always bury themselves in the very traps they set for others.